Chapter 41 Making Moonshine. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Frank held a red solo cup in his hands. In this cup was an amber liquid that had been made in his garage. He and his friends took a sip from the hard liquor that they had personally distilled and coughed. It was strong, really strong. One of the boys looked at Frank with an intoxicated expression on his face. He had to be no older than 15, which, for the record, so was Frank. The boy lifted his cup in cheers before taking another swig. We finally did it. We made some booze. After clanking his cup with the other boys, Frank took another sip. He could feel the sense of intoxication wrap around his mind like a warm blanket. He had a wide smile on his face as he playfully shook the kid sitting next to him. "It's all thanks to Ed here. If not for your wicked smart brain, we'd probably be blind right now." The boy named Ed smiled back and pushed Frank's arm aside. He was slightly embarrassed to hear such compliments. "It's a simple matter of fermentation and distillation. If you guys actually paid attention in chemistry class, you could make it too." After saying this, the group of friends broke out into laughter, while calling Ed names. Dork. Nerd. Loser. Ed responded by drinking the rest of his cup in silence. Despite the name calling, he went on a long winded lecture about the process of distilling alcohol. "You see boys, my homemade recipe is really simple. My ingredients are as follows. 2.5 kilograms of 2-month-old wheat, 25 liters of water, 6 kilograms of sugar, 100 grams of alcoholic yeast, 0.5 liters of fermented milk." After obtaining these things, the first thing I do is prepare the malt by making a layer of wheat no larger than 2 centimeters in depth and soaking it in warm water. Then I place it in a warm place somewhere that has a temperature of around 18.25 degrees Celsius. After doing this, I wait a few days until the grain sprouts to a length of about 2 centimeters. After that, I mix it up and remove it from the water without dividing. From there, it is all about cooking the mash. You do this by adding warm water between 50.60 degrees Celsius and sugar to a 40-liter container and mix it well. Then you let it sit until the water cools down to about 28.30 degrees Celsius. Once the mash is cooled, you add the malt and the yeast and seal the container, allowing it to stay in a warm environment of between 18.28 degrees Celsius so that it can ferment. You let the malt ferment for a time span of 48.96 hours. After that, you strain the mash so that the wheat is separated. This grain can be used a couple more times, so make sure to hold on to it. From here, you add the 0.5 liters of fermented milk and then proceed to distill it. Distillation is a bit different, as you can see with my homemade still here. I use stainless steel to make the pot, the doubler, and the condenser. However, they can also be made of copper. The first thing we do for distillation is fill the pot with the mash and then heat it. Once it reaches 78.3 degrees Celsius, the alcoholic vapor rises through the cap and into a copper pipe called the arm, where it transfers into the doubler. After transferring to the doubler, extra water condenses out of the alcohol vapor onto the sides of the barrel, doubling the vapor's proof. The purified vapor then travels through another arm into a copper coil set into a barrel filled with cooled running water called the condenser. This is where the alcohol vapor condenses into liquid moonshine. After distilling the mash, you clean up your gear, and then distill the moonshine again for extra strength. Frank laughed when he heard this before insulting his friend in a joking manner. "You really are a nerd." Marcellus woke with a fright. He had just had another one of these strange dreams. The past 2 visions he had aided him in the agricultural and military fields. Yet now he had such a strange dream about distilling alcohol. Still, he could feel the intoxication he had suffered through during the dream. The alcohol in that dream was several times stronger than the wine he normally drank. If he could manufacture such a thing, then surely he could sell it for a high price. He did not know why he was having these dreams, but so far, they all appeared to be helpful to him. After all, the price he had paid to equip his army had severely depleted his treasury. If he could find a way to make a fortune of his own, then he would no longer have to worry about his expenses. Perhaps this dream was exactly what he needed. When Marcellus thought about such things, he could feel a tinge of excitement in his heart. Siegfried woke up shortly afterward and noticed Marcellus was sitting on the edge of the bed with his head held firmly in his hands. This was not the first time she had seen the man like this and immediately became concerned. "Marcellus, did you have another one of those strange dreams?" Marcellus did not dare to hide such a thing from the woman, and instead he nodded his head in silence while sighing heavily. Though she could only see his bare back, Siegfried knew that he was exhausted. She could only sit up and latch onto his back with her large, naked chest in an attempt to comfort him. Her hug was met with a smile as Marcellus's mind calmed itself. The young general kissed his slave's hand before tackling her onto the bed. Siegfried had a wry smile on her face as she taunted the man. "So soon? Did we not do this just before we went to bed?" In response to this, Marcellus merely laughed before kissing the woman passionately on the lips. In between his actions, he whispered into her ear. "It's fine, it is already morning." After saying this, the couple stared out the window towards the rising sun before engaging in their intimate behavior. After their activities were concluded, Marcellus and Siegfried took a bath together. The two of them sat in silence, as they both had many things on their minds. Having concluded their bath, Marcellus ate breakfast with Siegfried, while looking over reports of his soldiers' progress in their training. The men who had stayed behind were beginning to show real camaraderie, and the new conscripts who replaced the deserters had showed off their potential. If they were a full-time army, they might be combat-capable by now. However, they only trained part-time, and worked other jobs for the rest of the day. Thus, it was taking longer than Marcellus had desired for his soldiers to be ready for the upcoming war. He dwelled on this fact for several moments while eating the meal that Siegfried had prepared for him. After finishing the food on his plate, Marcellus kissed Siegfried before departing from the villa. "Work calls. I will be back by nightfall." Siegfried merely nodded her head in response with a smile on her lips. "Be safe." Upon hearing this, Marcellus left the villa where he entered the village below the stronghold. He visited the blacksmith once again. Deciding to gamble on his visions, Marcellus wanted to commission a proper still so that he could make the same alcohol from his dream the night before. The man named Cadus had the same stoic expression he always had on his face as he pounded away at the metal on his anvil. He looked up and gazed upon Marcellus' arrival for a brief second, acknowledging the man's presence before getting back to work. Marcellus smiled awkwardly when he saw this before making his request. He pulled out a piece of paper that had the components he needed drawn onto them and handed it over to the man in question. "I need you to make these for me, out of copper. I'm willing to pay whatever price you desire." Cadus nodded his head before raising 3 fingers and saying the words, 3 millierents. Marcellus did not hesitate, and took out his coin pouch before handing 3 large silver coins to the man. He quickly got back to his work, where he responded with the given time frame to complete the order. "You can expect delivery in 2 to 3 weeks." Marcellus merely nodded his head in agreement before departing from the blacksmith's shop. After doing so, he continued about his business managing the affairs of Rhaetia. He was quite excited to see if his dream was actually reality. If so, he knew he would make a fortune of his own soon. He did not know what price this moonshine could fetch, but he knew it would be a luxury item with a high demand. The patricians in Rome would claw at each other's throats to get a taste of his new alcoholic beverage. Chapter 42 The Downfall of the Supreme Commander. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Flavius Claudius Constantinus stood in Hispania, gazing at the scene of a burning city. Fearing that Stilicho would capture him in a pincer movement from the diocese of Hispania, and the Italian heartland, the man had foolishly marched his armies into the region. Unfortunately, he was not recognized by the people of Hispania as the emperor he claimed to be, as the region was fiercely loyal to the Theodosian dynasty. The result was an outright rebellion. The man known commonly as Constantine III could hardly contain his anger, and after a fierce battle that saw much of his forces defeated, he had lit the city ablaze. Bodies lay piled in the streets, and heads were mounted on spears to show an example as to what happened to those who defied the false emperor. Even the soldiers beneath Constantine's command were slightly unnerved at the horrific actions they were commanded to engage in against the citizens of Rome. However, none dared to question the man they previously declared to be the true emperor. Among the ranks of the army were the Frankish foederati, who swore their allegiance to the usurper. With the death of yet another of their chieftains by the hands of the Gothic foederati commander Sarus, a new man had risen to prominence among the Franks. His name was Hagen, and he was yet another towering barbarian. Hagen had a wide grin on his face as he held onto a naked woman who was bound and gagged. This Roman woman was carried on top of his shoulder, and was his prey for the night. When Constantine gazed upon the sight of such a thing, he merely nodded his head in silence. As promised, the foederati beneath his command were given coin, wine, and women as payment for their services. The women who accompanied the barbarian warriors were those captured from enemy villages and cities. Much like the armies of Stilicho, Constantine was all too reliant on the barbarian foederati to maintain his control over the territory he laid claim to. Hagen had a toothy grin on his face as he sarcastically thanked the false emperor for his generosity. Such a kind emperor, giving us Franks plenty of women to fuck. I rather like this one. She's got a bit of a fierce streak, and I look forward to breaking her spirit. Constantine said nothing as he gazed upon the man. It was bad enough that he had to sell his own people to the Franks, but the nerve of this barbarian, saying exactly what he was going to do to his face. He could hardly stand it. He gritted his teeth as he finally agreed to the man's request. If you like her so much, then take her. Begone from my sight. The woman tried to scream, but the cloth in her mouth prevented her from saying anything. After that, Hagen went to the nearest private area and forced himself onto the woman he had captured. Such acts were occurring all across the blazing city as the Franks raped and pillaged to their heart's content. Constantine was just glad that the battle was over, and he could move on to the next city that dared to defy his rule. As for the Romans beneath his command, they were outraged, but there was little they could do. They composed of 1/3 of Constantine's troops, and could not defeat their barbarian allies should they impede their conquest. Thus, all Constantine and his Roman forces could do was to yield to the Franks' desires. It was the fault of those who lived in the region for resisting his rule. If they did not want such terrible things to happen to them, then they should have bent the knee. With this, Constantine was forced to fight against the Theodosian revolt in Hispania. While the diocese of Hispania revolted against the rule of the false emperor, the Eastern Roman Empire was in a state of chaos. Arcadius was dead, leaving behind a 7-year-old child to succeed him. Theodosius II, the young boy emperor of the East, was alone in the palace while his regent, the Sassanid king, tended to the needs of his court. The boy knew nothing about politics, or the troubles that his regent was currently going through. Instead, his regent, Yazdegerdai, was taking care of everything behind the scenes. Currently, he was worried about a few rumors that had found their way to his ears about a potential threat to her son's life, and she was taking every measure to counter it. Unbeknownst to him, the snake Olympus had long since been spreading rumors about Flavius Stilicho. Among these was the notion that the man was responsible for the death of the late Praetorian prefect of the East Flavius Rufinus. Whether true or not, these rumors proved to be a way for the Sassanid king to weaken the West. Of course, Rufinus' death had occurred over a decade ago. Despite this, the Sassanid king made use of these rumors to overthrow Stilicho. After all, the supreme commander of Western Rome's forces desired to retake Illyricum for the West. Such a thing could never be allowed to happen, and because of this, the regent of the boy emperor wrote a letter to the Western Roman emperor in an attempt to convince him to do something about his treacherous supreme commander. He had become a pawn of Olympus without even realizing it. After dispatching the letter to Ravenna, the man sighed heavily before approaching the boy he thought of as his own son. He had an anxious expression on his rugged face as she stroked the boy's hair and assured him everything would be all right. "Do not fret, boy, your father has left me to your care, and I intend to look after you until you are capable enough to rule on your own." Too young to realize how distressed his regent was, the young Theodosius merely smiled and nodded his head innocently. Such a cute reaction caused the man to temporarily be relieved. After a while, the regent tucked his charge into bed. He had done everything he could to protect the East. Not all he could do was wait. With the Theodosian revolt in the West, and the death of Arcadius in the East, Olympus used this as an opportunity to get rid of his rival. Stilicho had unknowingly made a grave error by forcing the senators of Rome to pay tribute to Alaric in order to stay the barbarians' wrath. Olympus had long since sown the seeds of distrust within the dim-witted mind of the Emperor Honorius and the Senate as a whole. He started by using Stilicho's willingness to pay the ransom to the Goths as a means to suggest he was conspiring against the throne. Then he spread falsehoods about Stilicho being responsible for the death of his rival, who perished at the hands of his Gothic federati a decade earlier. Such things could not be proven, but in the minds of many who opposed the supreme commander, they made sense. After all, the two men were heated rivals. After the death of Arcadius, Olympus did not waste any time, and instead spread rumors that he planned to usurp not only the Western throne for his godson Marcellus, but instill his own blood-related son on the throne in the East, in doing so making himself the shadow behind a reunited Roman Empire. These false allegations had spread to the Western Roman army, and now in the city of Ticinum, a group of mutineers held their blades in their hand as they turned against their general and officers. A particularly ugly man stabbed his blade through the chest of general that Stilicho had placed in charge of the region. "Traitor! Your barbarian master has assassinated Flavius Rufinus, conspired against his highness Honorius in an attempt to place his disgraced godson on the throne as a puppet, and has done the same in the East against the son of Arcadius. You will all die for your sins against the empire." The city of Ticinum turned into a bloodbath, as those loyal to the supreme commander were slain where they stood by the soldiers beneath their command. A struggle ensued between the two sides, but ultimately those who were convinced of Stilicho's misdeeds prevailed. By the morning of the next day, the streets of Ticinum were marred with the blood of Stilicho's supporters. While Marcellus reinforced his power in Rhaetia, his godfather had been driven into a corner with no escape. The enemies of Stilicho had banded together to cause his downfall, and soon the man would have to answer for his supposed crimes. Unfortunately for Stilicho, those in power did not care for the truth or even the glory of Rome. Instead, these craven bastards cared only for their personal vanity. Chapter 43 The Death of Flavius Stilicho. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Olympus stood in a room with Honorius. The two of them were engaged in a discussion about how to proceed. The mutiny in Ticinum had forced the emperor's hand. Stilicho had to be removed from power. Honorius was completely unaware that the architect of his regent's downfall was the same man he was discussing the issue with. Olympus spoke words of venom as he delivered the final blow to Flavius Stilicho. "Your Majesty, we have received reports that Stilicho has been funding the manufacture of arms and armor for Marcellus Limitanii. It is an absurdly large amount of supplies for such a small frontier force. I believe he intends to use Marcellus and his soldiers to raise a rebellion. If you do not act quickly, then your position will be usurped." Honorius could hardly believe Olympus' words. However, it appeared that Stilicho truly was a traitor seeking to usurp his position and that of his nephews. After all, the letter in Honorius' hand was from his sister-in-law pleading with him to take action. With so many forces in motion, Honorius had no choice. With a heavy sigh, the emperor uttered the words that condemned Stilicho to his fate. Henceforth, Flavius Stilicho is deprived of his position as Magister Militum, and is to be arrested. This conspiracy ends now. Olympus, I hereby name you the new Magister Militum. Your first task is to round up the men who are loyal to Stilicho and execute them. With a wicked grin on his face, Olympus bowed his head before accepting the position. Yes, your majesty. After saying that, the man departed from the palace in Ravenna and began to round up and execute all the men who were loyal to Flavius Stilicho. There would be no mercy for the former supreme commander and all his forces. BL.net Stilicho resided within his villa in the city of Ravenna. News had spread to him about the orders for his arrest, and that of his men. By now, most of his followers had been slain. Before he surrendered himself to the whims of the foolish Emperor Honorius, he had one last thing to do. Stilicho frantically wrote down a letter to be delivered to Castra Regina. Its contents were known only to him. After placing his seal on the envelope, he handed it off to a messenger in the dead of night, giving him strict instructions. You ride for Castra Regina, and you personally deliver that letter to Titus Claudius Marcellus, and no one else. Do you understand me? Do not stop until Marcellus has received this letter. The messenger nodded his head in silence. He was one of the last men still loyal to Stilicho, who had not been arrested and executed. Tears streamed down the young man's eyes as he pleaded with Stilicho to flee for his life. Sir! Come with me. It is not too late for you and your family to escape this madness. A bitter expression was fixed across Stilicho's haggard face. He simply shook his head in disagreement before placing a hand on the young man's shoulders. Constantine raises his army in the west, and in the east Alaric eyes Rome with a heart of greed. I will not rebel against Honorius and further divide the empire into chaos. My fate is sealed. Go now. Marcellus can protect you. Upon hearing this, the messenger mounted his horse and snapped the reins before leaving his parting words with Stilicho. It has been an honor to serve you. May we meet again in the afterlife. After saying this, the man rode off into the dark of night towards Marcellus' stronghold. Not long after, Olympus appeared before Stilicho with a retinue of soldiers. The snake-like man had a fiendish smile curved upon his lips. He boasted of his victory as he took the man who had been holding the empire together into custody. Under the orders of the Emperor Honorius, I am here to arrest you for the crimes of treason. Flavius Stilicho, come quietly, and I promise you a quick death. Stilicho sighed as he gazed up towards the moon one last time before offering himself into Olympus' custody. His wife and children screamed as they tried to resist, however they were eventually captured as well. Olympus bit his lower lip in displeasure as he saw Stilicho surrender without a fight. He wanted to torture the man a little before taking his life. Unfortunately, that was not the case. He spat on the ground before dragging Stilicho and his family off towards the palace. After arriving at the palace, Stilicho kneeled before Honorius, who eyed the man who had raised him with a hint of disdain in his eyes. The petty emperor cursed the man who had always protected him while spitting the same venomous words that Olympus had poisoned his mind with. Did you honestly think that I would not find out about your schemes? You have betrayed me, Stilicho, and now you must pay the price for your treasonous actions. Don't you worry, I will make sure that Marcellus is reunited with you soon enough. It was at this moment Stilicho broke out into a fit of uncontrollable laughter. He had accepted his fate, but he would make sure his last words rang throughout Honorius' mind until his final days. Honorius, you are a fool. You have allowed this serpent to poison your mind against the one man who has always had your best interests in heart. But it is no matter, though I will not divide the empire into further chaos by rebelling against your madness. That does not mean that he will be so docile. He always told me you were an idiot. He assured me you would one day be responsible for the death of the empire, and until now, I never believed him. Sure, you're an incompetent fool, but you always had me to look after you. You can take my life. It does not matter. I am already an old man at the end of my days. However, by the time your armies reach Castra Regina, the man that you seek will be long gone. I die knowing that you will have to live the rest of your miserable existence in fear that at any given time, that man can raise a rebellion against you. Without me, you will have no way of defeating him. Your days are numbered, Honorius, so enjoy your petty life while you still have it. Stilicho's last words dumbfounded Honorius. He knew the old man was referring to Marcellus, and the very idea that bastard had such a view of him drove the foolish emperor mad with rage. He could not hold back his fury any longer and immediately ordered Stilicho's execution. Off with his head. The executioner kicked Stilicho over onto his knees while raising his axe in the air. The last look on the old man's face was a smug expression while his eyes challenged the authority of the emperor. Stilicho died, knowing that Marcellus would avenge him. With the swing of an axe, the former supreme commander of Western Rome was beheaded. However, his death did not please Honorius. Instead, the look on the man's face when he died only acted as fuel to the fire in the foolish emperor's heart. Honorius did not hesitate. He quickly gave the order to his new supreme commander, one that would forever change the fate of Rome. Find Marcellus, and bring me his head. Olympus had a cruel smirk on his face as he bowed before the emperor and responded in affirmation of his orders. As you command, my emperor. In the year 408 AD, Flavius Stilicho was executed after being wrongly accused of treason. With his death, the Western Roman Empire now lacked a capable commander to keep its many enemies at bay. Soon, the Italian peninsula would find itself in turmoil. When Marcellus finally learned what had occurred in the capital, he would be left with two paths in life. Flee to the east and live out the rest of his days in peace and luxury. Or take up the sword of rebellion and avenge the death of his godfather. Chapter 44 Declaring Rebellion. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Weeks had passed since Stilicho's death and currently Marcellus was leading a march of his soldiers, who were clad in their new and shiny equipment that had recently been delivered from Rome. To Marcellus and his army of Limitanii, it was just another day at the border of the civilized world. However, as Marcellus and his soldiers were on a march a few kilometers away from Castra Regina, they encountered a troublesome situation. An army of 30,000 men had marched their way from the Italian heartland and into his borders completely unannounced. When Marcellus' scouts reported this to him, he was truly flabbergasted. He could not fathom who they were, or how they appeared in his lands. Regardless of who these men were, or why they had entered his lands, Marcellus had no choice but to intercept them. After all, an army of this size could cause significant damage to the people in the villages. Thus, he used the mountainous terrain of Rhaetia to his advantage and set up his army in a narrow pass. The Roman Limitanii lied in wait within the mountain pass some time before the unknown force arrived. Upon seeing such a well-armed group of Roman soldiers blocking the way into Naricum, the man in charge of this foreign force was perplexed, that is, until he gazed upon the face of the Roman general. It was a face he was all too familiar with, and if it was any other time, he would be quite pleased with such a chance encounter. However, things were not so simple right now, and he did not know if Marcellus would turn on him in the next moment. Still, it was better to attempt a peaceful negotiation, thus a bitter smile formed on the man's face as he walked ahead of his army and approached the young Roman general. Marcellus, you're still alive. I thought for sure they would have claimed your head by now. What with everything that has happened in the capital, you should be that bastard's first target. Marcellus was just as shocked to see Sarus as he was to see him. As far as he was aware, this man and his federati should be in Ravenna beneath Stilicho's command. Not to mention the words he spoke. Something didn't feel right about this situation, and Marcellus spoke in a cautious tone as he questioned the Gothic chieftain in front of him. Sarus, what are you doing in my lands? If you have turned your back on Rome and have come to join Alaric, I advise you to think carefully. You know what Stilicho will do when he finds out you have abandoned your post to aid the enemy. Upon hearing such a threat, Sarus stared at Marcellus in disbelief. His thoughts escaped from his lips as he uttered the words in astonishment. You didn't hear. Judging from the expression on Sarah's face, something serious must have happened. Marcellus was right to be cautious. He rested his hand on his hilt, in fear that Sarah might try something as he further interrogated the man. Hear what? Sarah merely shook his head as he informed Marcellus of everything that had happened in his absence. Stilicho is dead. Honorius had him executed for treason. I'm surprised you're still alive. They were supposed to have dispatched an army to claim your head. Have you been here in Rhaetia this entire time? Marcellus could hardly believe what he was hearing. He felt as if he had entered another reality where nothing made sense. He stammered as he tried to come to terms with what Sarah had told him. SST. Stilicho is dead. A grim expression was on Sarah's face as he continued to explain what was going on in the empire. Envied it, Stilicho is dead, and that bastard Olympus ordered the executions of our wives and children. Blood was shed in the streets, unprovoked, and it is because of that we have sworn to gain our vengeance. We march to Naricum to join Alaric so that we may raze Ravenna to the ground. The soldiers of Marcellus' army were in just as much disbelief as Marcellus when they heard these words. None of this made any sense. How could such a thing happen? Marcellus was in shock. He stumbled backward as he heard the words that Sarah spoke. Just what madness had occurred in the capital while he was tasked with protecting the border? He gazed upon the Gothic foederati in disbelief. He could feel their anger. It was clear that they were prepared to attack at any moment. The only thing keeping them from pouncing at the Romans in front of them was the orders that Sarah had given them. Marcellus could tell by the hatred in their eyes that everything Sarah had said was true. It took him a few moments to process through his shock and grief. However, he knew now was not the time to break down and cry. Instead, he had to take action. Having fought back the tears that welled up in his eyes, Marcellus gazed upon the Gothic foederati and made a desperate gamble. If what you say is true, then I will not stop you from entering Naricum. However, you all know me. Many of you have served beneath me in the past, and others know my reputation. If Flavius Stilicho has been executed at the behest of the Emperor Honorius under false charges, then the Emperor has betrayed Rome and its people. I will not pretend like we are friends. However, there is a bond between us. You know that if you march into Naricum and swear your allegiance to Alaric, he will use you all as fodder. After all, you are the Goths who previously sided with Rome. Alaric has no siege weapons. Even with you by his side, he cannot penetrate the swamps that surround Ravenna, let alone the city. If it is vengeance that you desire, then I shall give it to you. Swear your service to me, fight under my banner as my foederati, and I promise you I will not only deliver you the head of that bastard Honorius, but those of everyone who is responsible for the deaths of your loved ones. You know what I am capable of, and you know I deliver on my promises. Before you march into Naricum, think carefully about who it is that is most capable of fulfilling your vengeance. Men of Rome, move aside, and let these warriors choose their own path. After saying this, the army of Roman Limitanii parted in the center, allowing a gap for the Gothic foederati to pass through. However, not a single warrior stepped forward. Instead, they were waiting for their leader's response. Sarah gripped the shaft of his spear tightly while gritting his teeth. He wanted nothing more than to exit the service of Rome, but he knew Marcellus well. If he and his men stepped foot into Naricum, they would have to fight their way through the ranks of Marcellus' soldiers in order to get their vengeance. Victory would be assured, but it would be a bloody battle. Ultimately, Sarus decided to speak with the members of his tribe about what they planned to do. He took a step back from where Marcellus stood and discussed his options with the leaders of his people. One of them had a worried expression on his face as he questioned Sarus' thoughts. You're not really thinking of agreeing to his request, are you? Sarus, you cannot trust the word of Roman. However, Sarus was unconvinced and instead spoke up on Marcellus' behalf. What about the word of a Roman who was raised by a Vandal? It was true that Marcellus was raised by Stilicho, a man who was half Vandal. It was because of this that the Gothic foederati had such respect for the man. After realizing that perhaps Marcellus would keep his word, the 30,000 men squabbled among themselves. Until finally, a consensus was decided. Sarus stepped forward once more and addressed Marcellus, who stood with a confident expression on his face. "If we follow you, we demand justice for our families. Everyone who took part in the slaughter of our loved ones must be handed over to us, regardless of their position in Rome." Marcellus nodded his head and spoke a single word. Done. Upon hearing his conditions met, Sarus nodded his head in silence. After doing so, he knelt down and unsheathed his blade, offering it in service to Marcellus. He made a shocking declaration as he did so. "I offer to you ducks. No. Emperor Titus Claudius Marcellus, my sword, and that of my people as foederati of the Western Roman Empire, and its true ruler. For the Emperor." Upon seeing this, the Roman Limitanii and the Gothic foederati together lifted their weapons into the air and chanted the phrase. "For the Emperor." The young general could only sigh in defeat. He had never desired, nor expected himself to be proclaimed emperor. However, Honorius had forced his hand. By unjustly executing Stilicho, and laying false charges against himself, Marcellus could only respond with open rebellion. Marcellus had no way of knowing this, but Honorius' forces intercepted the letter that was supposed to be delivered to him. Despite Stilicho's last words to his killer, he had written a letter to Marcellus, pleading with him to flee the empire. In this letter was a request to not divide Rome into further chaos. Unfortunately, this letter was now lost to history, and Marcellus had learned of his godfather's death in an unexpected manner. In doing so, he had raised a rebellion against an already fractured empire. Chapter 45 Uniting Rhaetia. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Marcellus was currently within Castra Regina, with Sarus and Ordius by his side. For the time being, the defection of the Gothic foederati, and Marcellus' open rebellion remained an in-house secret. He could not afford to simply march on Ravenna with his recently acquired forces. Such a thing needed much time for preparation and planning. It was because of this that Marcellus decided to stake his claim in the spring of the next year. For the time being, Marcellus had other worries that occupied his mind. Alaric sat on his eastern border with an army of Gothic warriors at his behest. At any moment, they could flood his borders and cause a massive war to take place. If this weren't bad enough, Rhaetia remained divided, split into two smaller provinces. The dux of the westernmost region of Rhaetia was a man unfamiliar to Marcellus, and he feared the man may cooperate with the approaching Roman army sent by Honorius to claim Marcellus' head. If Marcellus were to survive the upcoming winter, then he would need to do two things: negotiate with Alaric, and potentially coerce him towards his side, as well as consolidate all of Rhaetia under his control. It was for this reason that he had dispatched a messenger towards the dux of Rhaetia. The man in question was named Decius Flavius Primus, someone Marcellus had never actually met before. However, he commanded an army of 3,000 men Marcellus desperately wanted to incorporate into his army. The two of them had some correspondence via letters over the past couple of weeks, and had agreed to meet within the villa of Castra Regina. The appointed hour was drawing near, and Marcellus was growing anxious. Despite this, Sarus seemed to be in a good mood. He was confident that Marcellus could convince the other dux to join his side. After all, Olympus' rise in power was a threat to all of Rome, especially those who maintained the borders. Suddenly the doors to the villa bursted open, and a man in the armor of a Roman general entered the scene. Primus was a man in his late 30s, or perhaps his early 40s. He had medium hair that had begun to gray, and a matching beard. He was relatively tall for a Roman, much like Marcellus, and had the robust figure of a warrior who had spent his life fighting battles on the frontier. He held his plumed helmet under one arm, and proudly strode into the center of the villa where he greeted Marcellus. "I presume you are Titus Claudius Marcellus." It is an honor to meet a man of such renown. I know why you have asked me to come here, and I will let you know before our negotiations take place that I am interested in what you have to say. However, even so, it will not be easy to buy my loyalty. Marcellus stood before the man and sized him up with his eyes. After the two had waged a little war with their gaze, Marcellus smiled before bringing Primus to the dining hall where Siegfrieda and the other house slaves had prepared a feast. For now, let us eat. I am sure the journey was a long and treacherous one. Enjoy the fruits of my land. We can discuss matters of importance over a nice meal. Primus did not disagree with Marcellus' suggestion. He and his officers followed Marcellus into the dining hall, where they began to take part in food and wine. After they had dined on some appetizers, Marcellus decided to break the ice. I suppose you know that I have been declared a traitor by Honorius. If so, then you can take a guess of why I have called you here. Primus nodded his head in silence before taking another sip of his wine. After doing so, he wiped his lips with a tablecloth before responding to Marcellus' words. You seek to raise a rebellion against Olympus and his puppet. I see you have gained the support of the Federati whose families were slain by that damned fool. I am an old man who has spent his life protecting the borders of the empire. My forces are limited, and I have little to offer. Tell me what it is in particular you desire of me. It would appear Primus was the type of man to be direct. Marcellus appreciated this quality of his, and thus he responded in the same manner. Since you are so blunt, allow me to return the favor. If I am to survive the winter, and feed my armies, then Rhaetia needs to become united. My request is simple, swear that I am the one true emperor of Rome. Combine your forces with my own into a proper legion, and I will name you legatus over the first legion of the rebellion. Primus nearly spat out his wine when he heard this condition. His interest was piqued the moment he heard the words legatus and legion. He immediately asked for clarification over the matter. You seek to return to the days of the Principate. In response to this Marcellus merely shook his head. It was true that he wanted to remodel his armies after days of past glory, however politically he was more ambitious, and thus he made his intentions very clear to the man he was requesting aid from. No, I do not seek to return to the days of the Principate. The Senate has outlived its use. The fools who reside in its halls are all corrupt old bastards who seek only to enrich themselves at the expense of the empire. If we are to save Rome from its total destruction, then we need to cleanse this corruption from our society. The only way to achieve this is to consolidate power under a single man's authority. My authority. After I have defeated Honorius and taken the throne for myself, I will declare a dictatorship, and use my newfound powers to fully restore Rome to its former glories. I shall purge anyone who impedes this progress. This is only a temporary measure. I promise that after the empire is united once more, and stronger than it has ever been, I will restore the Senate and ensure that proper men sit in its halls. Upon hearing this, Primus reacted in a way Marcellus had not expected. He broke out into a fit of uncontrollable laughter. After a while, he calmed down before expressing his thoughts on Marcellus' grand plan. So you see yourself as Caesar. Interesting, very interesting. I have not heard someone so boldly declare their desire for power in a long time. However, I have heard many tales of your selfless service to the empire. Going so far as to give up your own freedom so that your men could return to the empire safely. You are a bold one, and perhaps that is what we need right now. I do not have many years left, but I do not wish to sit back and wait while the empire collapses on itself. Fine, you have convinced me. Either your plan works and the empire is saved, or we all die bloody. It's exciting, isn't it? Titus Claudius Marcellus. I hereby declare you the one true emperor of Rome, and pledge to support you in your endeavors to claim the throne from the traitor Honorius. Rhaetia is yours, to do as you wish. Upon hearing this, a smile spread across Marcellus' face. By uniting his Limitanii with those under Primus' command, he could form a proper legion of 6,000 men. Though it paled in comparison to the Gothic foederati who vastly outnumbered the Romans in his army, it was a proper start to a better future. He dubbed this legion Legio I, and would spend the fall and winter gaining profits so he could properly equip them with the same gear he had outfitted his 3,000 men with. Though it would be difficult to find a manufactorum that would side with his rebellion, he was sure that he could achieve it. By spring of the next year, a full-fledged legion would be formed, and ready to march on Ravenna. Currently, things were progressing smoothly for Marcellus' plans. Unfortunately, there were still two very important matters he had to worry about. Alaric was still a threat to his eastern border, and in the west, an army of Roman soldiers marched to claim his head for Olympus and his puppet of an emperor. Before he could march on Ravenna, he would need to deal with these two major threats once and for all. How he intended to do that, he did not know. However, he was certainly an opportunity would present itself soon enough. For now, Marcellus had to consolidate his newly acquired territory and introduce his agricultural reforms to the rest of Rhaetia. With the region united under Marcellus' rule, and an army of 30,600 men beneath his command, he would soon become a force to be reckoned with on the battlefield. Chapter 46 Let It Burn. You are listening at novelfull.audio. In the city of Ravenna, the foolish Emperor Honorius was throwing a fit to his new supreme commander. It had been weeks since Stilicho was executed, and yet Marcellus was supposedly still standing in Rhaetia. The overgrown man-child needed an explanation for why this was the case. Olympus, you told me you dispatched an army to Rhaetia. Why have I not heard a word yet from them? I want Marcellus' head. In response to this, Olympus scratched his head before revealing the reality of the situation to the emperor. Your Majesty, the Gothic foederati have defected. Without their support, we do not have the means to fight Marcellus. I have recalled the army that was sent to his lands to protect Ravenna. Without them, Constantine would march his armies into our lands, or worse, Alaric. You must be patient. I assure you that Marcellus is going nowhere. We have intercepted Stilicho's letter, calling for him to flee and disposed of it. As far as Marcellus is aware, everything is normal. He should not even know of his godfather's death. This news did not please Honorius, who began to scream like a fat child who had been denied an extra slice of birthday cake. But you promised me he would die. Olympus, if you don't find a way to get rid of him, I will have your head removed for deceiving me. Olympus could only sigh in regret. Had he known what Stilicho was always dealing with, perhaps he wouldn't have had the man's head removed. Honorius was a petulant child, and convincing him to do anything was a major chore. Still, the man was quick-witted and came up with a solution that would appease the indolent emperor. How about we dispatch him a message informing him that his presence is required in Ravenna? Once he arrives, we have him arrested for treason and then behead him. Upon hearing this discussion, Honorius nodded his head in agreement. He very much liked this plan, and quickly ordered it to be enacted. Yes, yes. Send Honorius a message demanding his return to Ravenna. With haste, the longer he remains on the frontier, the more anxious I become. His mother still lives in Rome, have her arrested as well, and hold her hostage in case he refuses to comply. Olympus smirked as he heard this suggestion. Sometimes the idiot could use his brain, but in very rare circumstances. He bowed his head and spoke empty words of praise to please the emperor. Truly, your mind is the greatest in the realm. I could have never thought up of such a scheme. I will have the woman arrested at once. C. After saying this, Olympus departed from the palace and began to enact these plans. Enough time had passed, and Olympus had arrived in Rome, with a contingent of forces beneath his command. In order to ensure that everything went as planned, he personally led the task force to arrest Aeliana. At the moment, Marcellus' mother and Placidia were within the young girl's villa. During the past few weeks, they had been incredibly anxious about the ongoing changes in the empire. Placidia had barely enough time to grieve the passing of her foster father. Worse yet, the emperor seized Marcellus' assets. As a result, Aeliana had opted to live with Placidia until a time where new quarters could be established for her. The two women huddled over the fire as a rainstorm covered the city of Rome. Though they were beneath the cover of her villa's mighty roof, the cold steel seeped in through the walls. They had no idea that a group of Roman soldiers had surrounded the manor. Aeliana had a worried expression on her face as she prayed for her son's safety. "Do you think Marcellus will be all right? Surely he has learned the truth by now and fled to the east." Placidia was equally anxious. However, despite the need for calm words, she spoke the grim truth. "I think Marcellus will not have fled, it is not in his character. If anything, he is raising a rebellion as we speak, so that he may put my bastard of a brother to the sword. I can't believe Honorius would do this to Stilicho." Just when Aeliana was about to comment on the matter, the door to the villa was kicked open, and a group of armed soldiers rushed into the scene. Olympus had a wicked sneer on his face as he proclaimed the arrest of Honorius' mother. "Valeria Aeliana, you are under arrest for the crimes of high treason. Come with us now. If you resist, I will not hesitate to put you to the sword." The moment the soldiers approached the woman, Placidia jumped out in front of her to defend her. "What is this madness? Aeliana has done nothing wrong. You cannot arrest her without reason." However, Olympus was not tolerating the girl's defiance and backhanded her on the spot, forcing Placidia to her knees. "Galla Placidia, the emperor would like to have a word with you as well. Take them both." The Roman soldiers dragged the two women from the villa. Placidia continued to scream at the guards while Aeliana sobbed miserably. "You can't do this to me. I am the emperor's sister. Get your damn hands off of me this instant." Despite her cries of protest, the guards did not react, and continued to ruthlessly drag the two women off towards Ravenna. It did not take long for word to reach Marcellus. An imperial messenger approached Castra Regina with a protective guard. Initially Marcellus was hesitant to allow him entry, but he had not officially declared rebellion yet, and thus he thought to entertain Honorius' ploy. Marcellus, Primus, Ordius, and Sarus were all standing in the great hall of the Roman villa that acted as Marcellus' residence. They were all clad from head to toe in their armor, and were prepared in case violence broke out between them and the false emperor's lackeys. The messenger strode into the room as if nothing was strange about this scene. Perhaps he didn't even realize who Sarus was. Instead, he handed a letter to Marcellus with a smug grin on his face. "Titus Claudius Marcellus, the Emperor Flavius Honorius, has demanded your return to the capital." Marcellus raised his brow in curiosity. Was Honorius so foolish that he thought Marcellus would fall for such an obvious trap? Still, he read the contents of the letter, which appeared to have been written in blood. The more he read from it, the more his expression sank. "Dear Marcellus, I would like to inform you that I have your mother as a hostage, so keep that in mind before you decide to reject my demands. Do you like the color of the ink? Pretty, isn't it? Your mother's blood, that is. I will keep this short. My demands are simple. You must ride to Ravenna forthwith and present yourself to me. You are a traitor, just like that bastard Stilicho, and I cannot allow you to live. So, what will it be, your head? Or your pretty mother's?" Such a condescending message filled Marcellus with rage. The fire in his eyes was enough to burn the soul of anyone he came into contact with. He responded to this news by backhanding the messenger, which immediately caused his bodyguard and Marcellus' troops to unsheath their blades. The messenger stared at Marcellus in disbelief, and before he could protest his treatment, Marcellus plunged his blade through the man's heart. After doing so, he severed the man's head and tossed it to one of his bodyguards. With a murderous glint in his eyes, he gave his response to Honorius. "You tell that little bastard that I will be returning to Ravenna, however, I won't be going alone. I will bring an army with me. When we finally arrive, if Honorius has so much as harmed a hair on my mother's head, then I will strip the skin from his bones piece by piece while he still draws breath. Go and take his head with you. After saying this, the bodyguards sheathed their blades and carried the severed head with them back to Ravenna. As for the commanders beneath Marcellus' authority, they began to chastise him for his ruthless response. What have you done? If we march on Ravenna now, Alaric's army will burn these lands to the ground, and kill everyone in it. We cannot leave Rhaetia undefended. However, Marcellus was far from a state of reason as he shouted back to his commander with wild eyes. Then let it burn. The officers beneath Marcellus' command gazed at the young general in disbelief, that is, until he made things clear. He has my mother. After saying this, Sarah snarled before making a comment about the whole damn situation. That fucking bastard. He won't dare ride out to battle himself, but he will murder innocent women and children and hold them as hostages. I'm with Marcellus. We cannot wait here any longer. Honorius must die. With that said, Marcellus's rebellion had begun in the fall of 408 AD. However, in doing so, they would abandon Rhaetia, and its people, to the mercy of Alaric and his Gothic horde. Chapter 47 Wasting Away. You are listening at novelfull.audio. It was difficult to assemble an army of 30,600 men, and despite this, Marcellus had given the order to muster, which was issued to every fortification where his legion and foederati held their ground. Men who were just recently having a jolly time drinking in their encampments were swiftly rounded up by their superiors and ordered to gather supplies. The campaign to claim Rome had begun earlier than anyone had expected. Everyone, including Marcellus, had expected the campaign to begin in the spring. They figured they could enjoy the winter huddled in their homes, awaiting out the snow with a village girl or two in their arms. Unfortunately, this was not the case. In order to compel Marcellus to surrender his life, Honorius had engaged in a rather devious action. He had arrested Valeria Aeliana, who was Marcellus' mother, and was holding her as a hostage. If Marcellus did not submit himself for execution, then Honorius would claim his mother's life. While Marcellus mustered his forces and prepared to march on Rome, Galla Placidia was ranting and raving to her brother, venting her frustrations about his wicked behaviors. You evil bastard! First you have Stilicho killed under false charges, and now you hold Marcellus' mother hostage. For what? Do you really believe the man will surrender himself to you just so you can behead him? Marcellus isn't so foolish. He will find a way to save Aeliana, and then he will come to claim your head. Do you have shit for brains, Honorius? How can you not realize this? Honorius did not take his sister's words lightly, and immediately reacted by backhanding her across her pretty face. In doing so, he busted her lip open while screaming at her. Marcellus will do as he is told, or I will kill his mother. There is no redemption for him. He has lived long enough, and even conspired against me. I am taking righteous action against those who wish to usurp me. The fact that you would side against me proves you to be a traitor, just like Marcellus. Perhaps I should have you thrown into the dungeons, and raped for your crimes. Such a vile threat caused Placida to falter backwards in fear. She had never seen her brother so furious before. However, she would not beg for forgiveness. She was adamant that what her brother had done was wrong. Still, in his current state, it was not wise to provoke him, so she simply lowered her head in indignation. Honorius smiled wickedly, mistaking her fury for submission, and grabbed a hold of the girl's cheek while inspecting her bleeding lip. You should know better than to make me angry, little sister. I don't know why you worship the man so much. What can he possibly do with a mere Limitanii? Marcellus has at most 3,000 men under his command. He will never be able to march on Ravenna with such paltry numbers. However, despite his boasts, Placidia was not convinced of her brother's victory just yet, nor had she accepted defeat. She quickly fired back with a witty retort, which instantly caused confusion to flood Honorius' mind. 30,300. At first, Honorius believed his sister had misspoken and questioned her statement. You mean 3,000? Marcellus only has 3,000 Limitanii under his command. Upon seeing the smug expression on her brother's lips, Placidia giggled maniacally before shaking her head and smiling at her brother with a wicked sneer. No, dearest brother, he has 30,300 men beneath his command. Initially, he would have only had 3,000, which I admit is not enough to take Ravenna, but then somebody had to go and butcher the families of the Gothic Federati, causing them to abandon the empire. Undoubtedly, they fled to Naricum to regroup with Alaric, but whose land do these Federati have to go through in order to reach Naricum? It was only now just dawning on Honorius why his sister had said 30,300, 30,000 Federati had fled through Marcellus' borders, presumably to meet with Alaric and join his side. However, what if Marcellus had met with them first? Marcellus was only denied his victory title because Honorius was petty, but such a thing did not deter the fear and respect that the Goths had for Marcellus. Many of the Federati who fled the service of Rome had previously served under Marcellus. They may not like the man, but they trusted his ability. A look of horror and panic spread across Honorius' face as he asked his sister for clarification. You don't mean? Upon seeing the state Honorius was in, Placidia broke out into laughter once more, while she slowly nodded her head. Brother, you have always underestimated Marcellus. You have time and again claimed that he had only achieved his position in life because he was the godson of Stilicho. However, the truth of the matter is, while Stilicho's nepotism did help Marcellus' career, his abilities as a commander, and the legends that follow him are the real deal. Do you think he won't be able to convince those 30,000 men to rally beneath his command once again? Marcellus is known for his fairness, and if they support him in overthrowing you, they know he will reward them more fruitfully than Alaric can. They also know that without Stilicho by your side, your chances of winning a war with Marcellus are virtually non-existent. You really fucked up, big brother. An army of 30,000 men are now marching towards Ravenna with a single purpose to claim your head. Who do you have to defend you? Olympus, and a few thousand soldiers at best. You have brought this upon yourself. Marcellus never wanted to rule the empire, he just wanted to serve it faithfully. If you actually knew the man like I do, then you would know he would never rebel against you, unless you betrayed him first. That's exactly what you have done, and now you will have to pay the price for listening to a snake like Olympus. Honorius suddenly realized that perhaps his sister was right, perhaps it was better not to have provoked a capable man like Marcellus. However, it was too late now. If the Federati had really rallied underneath the man's banner, then there was no possible way to sue for peace. Of course, Honorius was not capable of contemplation and growth, nor was he capable of admitting that he was entirely at fault for these problems. He could only blame a single man for everything that was occurring. In a furious shout, Honorius called out the name of the man he held responsible for Marcellus' rebellion. Olympus. However, Olympus was not nearby, and thus he could not witness the fury of the emperor, nor the fact that he now held the blame for the dire straits the empire was in. Of course, there was nothing Honorius could do about this other than resent Olympus. He still needed a supreme commander of what little forces he had, and nobody else seemed right for the job. Placidia took the time to sneak off from the quarters while Honorius was currently throwing a tantrum and visit Aeliana. When she entered the dungeons and saw the woman in the dark, bound, chained, and beaten, her heart bled upon witnessing such a scene. Placidia grabbed hold of the iron bars and called out to the woman, who appeared to be in rough shape. Aeliana, are you okay? There was a lifeless look in the woman's eyes, as if she had completely given up on the idea of surviving. After all, she was just bait to lure out her son, and she did not want any harm to come to her precious baby boy. The woman mumbled something beneath her breath, which Placidia did not hear at first. It doesn't matter. Placidia quickly reached her hand through the gaps of the bars and tried to comfort the woman, but she merely lied still, not even reacting to the gesture. Upon seeing the hopeless appearance of Marcellus' mother, Placidia called out to her, saying words she knew would invoke Aeliana's fury, just to rekindle her spirit. Aeliana, I never told you this, but I've always fancied your son, and though his heart lies elsewhere, I swear that after he and his army depose my brother, and he liberates you from your chains, I will make him marry me to cement his claim to the throne. I will bear his sons, and if God wills it, own his heart." Despite these words, Aeliana still said nothing. She was truly and utterly defeated. With a heavy sigh, Placidia left the dungeons, but before she did so, she left behind some parting words. "Dovico, don't worry, I'm sure Marcellus will save you." After exiting the dungeons, Placidia had developed a plan to free the woman herself. If Aeliana stayed in the dungeons any longer, then it would be hazardous to her physical and mental well-being. Hell, the woman was already broken, and Placidia could not allow that. It would take time, effort, coordination, and most importantly, luck. However, she believed that by the time Marcellus' army arrived, she could save the man's mother. With an excited smile on her lips, Placidia muttered the words under her breath. "Just you wait, Marcellus, I'll save your mother, or die trying." Chapter 48, Becoming the Villain That Is Needed. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Marcellus gripped the hilt of his spada with a bitter expression on his face. Currently, he was in the middle of a small agricultural town outside the borders of Italia. Because he had begun to march his army on such short notice from Rhaetia to Ravenna, Marcellus and his soldiers had lacked a proper logistical supply chain. To put it simply, he and his men had resorted to forcing local villages to give up their food stores. Upon seeing such a large army demand tribute from the local villages, most were reluctant but willing to give in to Marcellus' demands. However, this village, for whatever reason, was defiant. This posed a difficult dilemma for the self-proclaimed emperor. Should he leave this village be? Or should he compel them to see reason? The problem with the first option was that by allowing this village to defy his demands for food, he would invite future resistance from the other towns on his path to Ravenna. He could not allow such an example to exist, or his men would surely starve. There was also another factor in Marcellus' mind, one that was far more dire. Every second he was not marching was a second wasted. One where his mother was subjected to the torment of Honorius. With each passing minute, the probability of Aeliana's death increased. It was this proverbial blade that hovered over Marcellus' neck that caused him to act in such desperation. Normally, he would wait until the spring before marching on campaign. The reason for this was twofold. It would allow him to store up grain from the harvest for the long march to Ravenna. However, more importantly, it would allow Marcellus the necessary time to negotiate with Alaric, preventing him from ravaging the Roman countryside during his absence from Rhaetia. Unfortunately, Honorius had forced his hand, and hence why Marcellus was in such a rough state. By now, Alaric must have crossed the border into Rhaetia and was most likely ransacking the land at this very moment, something that did not sit well for all the soldiers in Marcellus' army. In anticipation of the Goths' cruelty, Marcellus had long since ordered the evacuation of Rhaetia and into Italia. The majority of the population, realizing that their protectors were marching on a campaign of rebellion, fled their homes and flooded the province of Italia. How far they could go, and how long they could avoid the war, nobody knew. For the time being, though, they were spared the cruelty of the Goths. Yet, as with every evacuation, there were those who were adamant and stayed behind. For those who were stubborn and chose this path, only death awaited them. None of this was Marcellus' concern at the moment, and thus he held the hilt of his blade, struggling to maintain his calm. Negotiations were going south, but he dreaded the idea of using violence to obtain the supplies he so desperately needed. The town's mayor was arguing with Marcellus over his demands, practically spitting in his face as he did so. "Be no calm, you have abandoned your post in Rhaetia, taken up arms against the emperor, and raised an army in rebellion. Now you ask that us simple village folk support you, at the cost of our own winter stores. If we do as you ask, come winter, we will starve. What is with you soldiers, always rebelling against your emperor? Can't you see us village folk want no part in it?" Marcellus struggled to maintain his civility as he negotiated with the man. However, no matter what he said, the mayor would reject him. He was as stubborn as the people who stayed behind in Rhaetia. Ultimately, Marcellus was forced to use the threat of violence. If you do not listen to my demands, we will take your grain by force. I assure you, if such a thing becomes necessary, we will not leave anything behind for you. I'm not asking for everything that your village has stored, just half. It was not just the town's mayor who was standing on the opposing side, but an entire mob of villagers who grabbed whatever pointy object they could find to resist the rebel general who had entered their lands and demanded that they hand over their food. These villagers were shouting and pushing at the Roman soldiers and the Gothic foederati. They had no respect for the men who had given up their homes, just so they could remove the false emperor Honorius, a man who had condemned Rome to a fate worse than death. Still, despite this, the Roman soldiers did not respond with violence, and remained calm. The foederati, on the other hand, were getting anxious. They were well accustomed to plundering villages for supplies. Because of this, they failed to see the reason that Marcellus would negotiate with these poor farmers. Upon seeing the state his men were in, Sarus approached Marcellus and whispered in his ear. I can't hold back my men for much longer. The moment these villagers become violent, this will turn into a bloodbath. Give me the order to take the goods by force, or you will have a massacre on your hands. Marcellus knew things were getting tense. He gazed around at the agitated Gothic warriors, who were prepared to engage in violence, as well as the enraged villagers who were about to foolishly give up their lives. In one last attempt to settle things peacefully, Marcellus made the town mayor aware of the reality. Mayor, I cannot hold back my Gothic friends here any longer. If you don't give us what we ask for, this town will be slaughtered. I beg of you to yield the requested grain before things get out of hand. Despite Marcellus' plea for peace, the mayor of the town merely spat on his shoes in disgust. He refused to yield his town's food surplus to a bunch of rebels. Regardless as to whether or not Marcellus won the war, his village would not survive to see it. If they were to die anyway, they might as well resist until the very end. Marcellus sighed as he was about to give the command to ransack the village. However, before he could do so, a young boy in the crowd of villagers threw a cow pie at Sarus, which landed on his face. Though Sarus merely wiped the dung from away with a look of displeasure, his warriors were enraged at the disrespect towards their chieftain and immediately stormed the gathered villagers with their weapons. Before Marcellus or Sarus could even react, the villagers had spears and swords thrust into the bodies, claiming their lives in the process. The Gothic foederati had lost their minds and entered into a battle frenzy, cutting down anyone who was not a part of their army. Marcellus tried to stop the slaughter, but it was too late. 30,000 men were in a state of frenzy as they raided the village for all of its value. Stop! Cease your actions this instant! Yet the cries of the villagers drowned Marcellus' voice out as the Gothic foederati butchered them like cattle. The violence that had suddenly erupted utterly dumbfounded the Roman soldiers of the First Legion. They stood in shock, as they did not know what to do. If the foederati were out of control, they did not have the means to rein them in. Soon the town was lit ablaze, and bodies were piled in the streets. The Gothic foederati rushed into the homes and plundered everything of worth. Not just food, but silver, gold, wine. Everything was stripped from the homes before the buildings were lit ablaze. Marcellus could only gaze in horror as the town was slaughtered. Oddly enough, the mayor was still alive, albeit barely. He clutched his bleeding abdomen as he grabbed onto Marcellus' ankle with his free hand. The look of hatred in the man's eyes haunted Marcellus as the mayor spoke the words. You did this. You and your damned rebellion. Why don't you see that? Even if you win the war, there will just be another young man like you in the future who will rise against you. Burn in hell, you damned traitor. After saying those words, the mayor keeled over and died. Marcellus gazed upon the blazing scene of the Roman village, and realized that in his desperation to free his mother from her captivity, he had become a villain, just like Honorius before him. Despite the overwhelming guilt Marcellus felt, he did not falter, instead his resolve grew. He realized at that moment that perhaps Rome needed a proper villain. A man whose tyranny would end the cycle of rebellion that had plagued the empire for centuries. Since there was nobody besides him who could assume this role, the responsibility for Rome's future fell upon his shoulders. Marcellus swore as he gazed upon the burning town that he would never forget the price that had to be paid to restore Rome to its former glory. He vowed to bear the burden that came with such a future, no matter how many innocent lives were lost in its pursuit. Chapter 49 Coming up with a plan of action. You are listening at novelfull.audio. After the incident on the borders of Italia, and the village that was slaughtered, Marcellus heavily reprimanded the Foederati for their actions, seizing their plunder for himself. However, that was the most that he could do to punish them. The truth of the matter was he needed them to win his war with Honorius, and to repel Alaric from the empire's borders after he had crowned himself emperor. Without the support of the Foederati, Marcellus had an abysmal army, and could not compete with the many threats that faced Rome. However, by stealing their plunder, the Foederati grew disgruntled, with only Sarus keeping their loyalties in check. Sarus himself was not bothered by the slaughter of the village. However, he had sworn his loyalty to Marcellus for the time being, and truthfully, he was slightly intimidated by the man. Marcellus had promised the Gothic Foederati money, land, and, more importantly, vengeance. To Sarus, those things mattered far more than the paltry sum they had gained from one small town. Thus, he had used every tactic he could think of to prevent his warriors from deserting in the time following the border fiasco. Since then Marcellus and his army had marched into Italia unopposed, forcing every village they came across to pay tribute in the form of food and other supplies. There was not much of a Roman army left at this point, at least not under Honorius' control. The remaining Roman forces were all in the hands of Constantine, and he was too busy with an uprising in Hispania to bother threatening the Italian peninsula at this point. Honorius and what little forces he had were holed up in Ravenna, believing they could outlast Marcellus and his army, and forced the man to surrender by threatening his mother. However, little did Honorius know that would not work on the man. Marcellus was smart enough to realize that his mother was already dead. Even if he surrendered himself to the mercy of the emperor, she would not be spared. Honorius would kill the woman in front of him just to make him suffer in his last moments. Thus, all he could do was to march on the capital and avenge the woman. He did not know that Placidia was in the middle of figuring out how to break Aeliana out from her cell. Placidia sat within a room, with several guards watching over her. Since her brief spat with her brother, she had been confined to her room for most of the day, only making appearances at mealtime. This was a response to Honorius' paranoia, who now believed his own sister had turned against him. He would not allow her to cripple his operations, and had thus kept her under house arrest in Ravenna. As a result, she had nothing to do but spend her hours thinking of the best way on how to escape, with Aeliana in tow. The longer the woman stayed in the cold, damp, and dark dungeons, the worse she would be. She had already lost the will to live and was wasting away. Because of this, Placidia knew she had to act quickly if she were to save the woman's life. Little did Placidia know that the guards who were assigned to watch over her were paranoid in their own right. Word that both Alaric and the Gothic Foederati had joined forces with Marcellus, and that the man was leading a large army to Ravenna. This was only half true, but the fear that such a massive force of Goths was being commanded by the man who was now widely recognized as Western Rome's greatest general had caused many in the city to go mad with fear. The men were conversing by themselves on the best course of action, unaware that the girl they were guarding was eavesdropping. "I'm telling you, we should take anything of value from the palace and flee the city. If an army of 60,000 Goths march on Ravenna, led by the infamous Goth Slayer, we will not be enough to defend the city. They will sack us, and then they will brutally execute anyone who still works for Honorius." However, another man in the group was a bit more level-headed and immediately countered this claim with some solid logic and reasoning. "You're just being paranoid. Ravenna is built in a swamp and is a fortress in its own right. Even if there were 100,000 Goths in the rebel army, they still won't be able to break through our defenses. They are barbarians. They have no siege weapons. This was rather solid logic except for one major important detail, which the third guard quickly spoke about. I'm pretty sure Marcellus knows how to build siege weapons. If he teaches the barbarians to do so, then we will surely lose the city. I mean, they might be crude, but a siege weapon is a siege weapon. It was at this moment that the once level-headed man had broken out into a cold sweat. The panic had just now begun to affect his mind. He looked around to see if they were being watched before leaning in and whispering to the other guards. What the hell are we going to do? If we stay here, we are as good as dead. Before anyone could speak up with a solution, a young and feminine voice filled the air. I know what to do. Such a sudden interruption caused the guards to shudder as they turned around and witnessed the adolescent girl, Galla Placidia, staring at them with a friendly smile. The men immediately became cautious as they witnessed the emperor's sister who they were supposed to be watching listening in on them. Just when the leader of them was about to rebuke the girl, one of the other guards spoke up. What do you know? Seeing that the bait had been bitten by the three fools in front of her, Galla Placidia did not hesitate to whisper treason into their ears. You know Marcellus is only coming to Rome because the emperor has kidnapped his mother and is threatening her life, right? If you were to work together to free the woman and deliver her safely to Marcellus, he will reward you for your efforts. At the very least, he will spare your lives. However, if he lays siege to this city, and Aeliana is killed by my brother, you can be assured that the men in my brother's army will be hunted down and executed in the most creatively violent ways that Marcellus can think of. And I assure you, Marcellus is an educated and creative man. The three guards looked at each other with complicated expressions. What the girl was suggesting was high treason, and if they got caught, they would surely lose their heads. However, the alternative was far worse. If the three of them sat by and did nothing as Marcellus laid siege to the city, then undoubtedly Honorius would kill the man's mother as a show of force. Such a thing would clearly enrage the rebel general, resulting in a complete and utter lack of mercy when his barbarian soldiers finally breached the city's defenses. At that point, they would be lucky if they got off easy with a crucifixion. The three of them shuddered as they thought about what horrors awaited them should they remain loyal to Honorius. After thinking about it for some time, the leader of the three guards nodded his head before speaking up to Placidia. What do you need us to do? Placidia wore a pretty smile as she heard the men agree to her suggestion. Now that the men who were supposed to watch her were on her side, she could move more easily in the shadows. She quickly laid out a plan for the men gathered. Right now, we need to embed at least one of you, or someone who can be trusted in the detail that protects Aeliana's cell. She is a high-profile prisoner, and she is protected well, especially now that my brother suspects my treachery. Once we have a man on the inside, we just need to wait until Marcellus lays siege to the city. When the rebel army arrives, chaos will ensue, giving us a brief period to free the woman before my brother tries to use her as a bargaining chip for Marcellus' surrender. We use our man on the inside to free her, where the rest of you will then lead her out of the city, and towards Marcellus' army, where you will hand her over in exchange for mercy to you and your families. The three men thought about the girl's words for some time before agreeing with them. They still had several weeks before Marcellus and his army arrived at Ravenna. Given the desperate situation, it would not be difficult for one of them to infiltrate the security detail that guarded Aeliana. The leader of the guards nodded his head once more before responding to Placidia's plan. It's the best chance we've got. Very well, we will work with you to free the prisoner and help her escape the city. Hopefully, with his mother secured, Marcellus will be more lenient to the people in the city, once he takes it. Placidia wore a pretty smile as she thanked the men for their assistance. Thank you. With this, we can save the city. In the meantime, act natural. We don't want my brother suspecting our plans. With this a plan was in motion to save Aeliana, and with it the people of the city of Ravenna, for if she died, Marcellus might unleash the Gothic horde beneath his command on the city, and its inhabitants resulting in a slaughter. Chapter 50, A Lesson of Discipline. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Marcellus awoke in his tent. The cold air of the last days of fall penetrated through the flaps, causing the man and his lover to shiver. As a result, Marcellus clung tightly to Sigefrida for warmth. Marching, from Rhaetia to Italy, had taken its toll on the young general. Day in and day out, he had to pretend like he was calm and that he was in control of his emotions. However, he had never been more anxious, nor heartbroken in his entire life. He doubted whether his mother was still alive, and even if she was, she existed as a prisoner in the dungeons of Ravenna. Undoubtedly terrible things had been done to her. Thinking upon such cruelty, Marcellus felt his heart constrict, as if a cage of thorns surrounded it, and every time the organ beat it was pricked. The only thing that kept him going was the warmth that his slave exuded. She had been with him every step of the way and had aided him in his grief. Upon sensing the cold, Sigefrida grasped hold of her lover's hand before shifting around under the fur covers so that her face was meeting her master's. She stole the first kiss of the morning, while the man was struggling to fall back to sleep. Upon seeing that the woman was in the mood for some intimacy, a smile spread across Marcellus' lips as his eyelids opened to reveal his olive-green eyes. He grabbed hold of the Swaby woman's beautiful face and caressed it lightly, before entangling his lips with her own. He did not hesitate to grope her substantial breasts as he pressed her beneath his firm body. Just when the two of them were about to become entwined, the flaps to the tent opened, and Sarus revealed himself. Marcellus sighed heavily upon realizing that someone had intruded on his fun, while Sigefrida hid her face in the pillow. Shame and embarrassment filled her heart as she tried to ignore Sarus's presence. The Federati commander shifted his gaze away from the scene, and whistled innocently as if he hadn't seen anything while escaping from the tent. It would appear Marcellus and Sigefrida would not be able to take part in their mourning tradition. As such, the two of them quickly got dressed, before Marcellus exited the tent and slapped Sarus on the back of the head. This better be important. Sarus ignored everything that had just happened and quickly reported the situation to the general. "Sir, we have trouble," Marcellus sighed once more before he openly expressed his thoughts on the matter. "Of course we do, lead the way." With this, he quickly followed Sarus into the heart of the encampment, where a group of Roman soldiers and Gothic Federati were in the heat of an argument. Sarus did not even have time to explain the situation, as one of the Romans pushed a Gothic soldier and shouted at him. "Filthy barbarian! You're only tolerated because we need fodder for the battlefield." The Goth immediately responded to this shove by punching the man in the face. "Fucking cunt. I'll have your head." Evidently, the man had some skill in pugilism, because he quickly sent the Roman soldier tumbling to the ground. This violence created a chain reaction where both sides quickly fought in a grand melee. Marcellus merely shook his head as he watched the men fight with fists and feet. If he did not do something soon, then this would undoubtedly turn bloody. As a response, he shouted as loud as he could, drowning out the noise of the conflict. "On your feet, maggots!" The men ceased their hostility when they heard the voice of the general, and dragged themselves to their feet, where they dusted off their clothes. Marcellus gazed upon them with fury in his eyes as he scolded them. "If somebody does not give me an unbiased report about what has occurred here in my camp, I will have you all flogged." Neither side was willing to compromise, and as such, the report ultimately came from a bystander who had observed the entire conflict. "Sir, our side started the fight. Legionary Vulso had wrongfully slapped the meal out of a Goth's hand. The victim demanded compensation, and as a result, the two exchanged words. Some unnecessary things were said by both sides, which caused the brawl that you witnessed." Marcellus quickly glared at the man named Legionary Vulso and interrogated him ruthlessly in front of his peers. "Is what this man said true?" The man tried to defend his actions. After all, he did not believe he was in the wrong. "I don't believe anything I said is unfactual. The Goths have butchered our people, and now they expect us to treat them well." It is simply an excuse. Before the man could finish his complaint, Marcellus drove his fist into his sternum so hard that the man collapsed to his knees. From there, he grabbed hold of the man's head and kneed him viciously. This caused the man to collapse to the floor entirely, where Marcellus called out to everyone who witnessed this event. Whatever petty squabbles you have with each other, end them now. We are at war. The empire is surrounded on all sides, and the emperor is a man who has brought us to the brink of ruin. I have 30.6 thousand men under my command, with no reinforcements in sight. I do not care if you are Roman or Goth, you fight together as one army, against a world of enemies. BL.net. The men, who were previously been at arms, gazed down at their feet in silence, refusing to meet the eyes of their general. They were utterly ashamed of their actions. Even the Goths felt a hint of guilt as they realized the situation they were in. They had trusted Marcellus to lead them to victory, and allow them to have fertile lands to settle. Fighting each other now would only result in a bloody defeat, and none of them desired such an end. Upon seeing that nobody was voicing a complaint, Marcellus quickly dished out the punishments to the soldiers in his army. Every single man who has taken part in this brawl will be sent to the front lines the moment the battle occurs. You will fight together as one unit, or you will die together as strangers. I will not tolerate infighting among my ranks. You are all lucky I need you fit and ready for combat, or else I would have the flesh stripped from your backs. Be thankful for the mercy I have shown you this day. After saying this, Marcellus withdrew from the scene where he waited in line for his daily rations. He would not use his authority as general to eat first, nor would he eat anything that his own soldiers did not dine upon. It was one of the reasons why Marcellus' soldiers all respected him. He lived under the same conditions as the soldiers in the army, with the exception that he had a beautiful slave tending to his needs. However, this was not something that he was alone privy to. There were plenty of slaves and prostitutes in the followers' camp. Many of the villagers from Castra Regina had followed the army, providing basic services, and the village girls who were particularly desperate would sell their bodies in exchange for food. So, in a way, Marcellus lived in the same way that the soldiers in his army did. He just had exclusive access to Siegfried. Marcellus thought about this as he sat at a table and dined on his rations alongside his soldiers. The scuffle had been stopped before it turned bloody, and the perpetrators were punished. As for the man who had spoken out against the men who started it, Marcellus would ensure that he was protected from any form of retaliation that the scoundrels might pursue. Though this was just a minor event, it served as a reminder to all the troops that they were a single army united against a world of enemies, and if they did not stand together, then they would surely fall in battle. Ordius and Primus witnessed this event and were further convinced that they were right to follow Marcellus in rebellion against Honorius. Had the emperor been witness to a similar dispute among his own ranks, he was unlikely to solve it so swiftly, or even at all. This was the difference between Marcellus and Honorius. One was a seasoned commander who had proven his competency as both a leader of men and a ruler over a large territory. The other was grossly incompetent and foolish, whose actions had caused the empire to fall to the brink. It was the firm belief of all men in this army that if Honorius were not replaced with a more capable leader, then the empire would not survive the century. Thus, they had all banded together, Roman and Goth alike, to put an end to the false emperor's reign, and seat the most capable man on the throne of the Western Roman Empire. In the grand scheme of things, such petty squabbles were beneath them and their goals. As a result, the men who had fought just recently quickly mended their wounds, and agreed to fight on the front lines together as penance for their actions.